Vagabond was moving towards Point Lookout with agonizing slowness. The nightmare of the war was compounded for Neil by the more personal and immediate nightmare of running in place, being unable to move forward no matter how hard he tried. It seemed like an endless crawl towards Crisfield with Frank in the wee hours of the morning, and since they had put him ashore just before dawn, an endless crawl in light winds across the bay. And as they struggled, the horror of the unfolding nuclear destruction was becoming more real. At the dock in Crisfield, Frank had tried to telephone his wife and reported back dully to Neil and Jim. The operator didn't even try. The operator said, "I'm sorry, sir, New York State has been disconnected." He laughed joylessly. They'd all listened in the darkness to the transistor radio, and on the entire AM dial they were able to bring in only 5 stations, where normally there would have been 40 or so. Dribs and drabs of hurried, sometimes barely coherent news drifted out. It often took the reporters several repetitions of each frightening report before a piece of grim news could be accepted as confirmed and indisputable. The idea that Washington and New York and apparently 50 to 100 other places had been destroyed and that 20 to 80 million people had already been killed, that was almost all major radio and television stations were not operating, and that the war was continuing. All this was beyond their ability to cope. It seemed to be beyond some of the announcers' abilities to cope as well. A few read the news items as if they were reading a weather report, and made it seem so absurd that at one point Frank giggled. Others would become emotional and eventually be replaced by a more controlled voice. One commentator pointed out that there was no way of knowing how many nuclear warheads had hit a given target, whether the target had been struck directly or peripherally, and whether the explosion had occurred on the ground or in the air. Knowledge that a place had been hit at all usually could only be deduced from its total silence. There were few eyewitness reports. All United States military personnel had been ordered to report for duty. If it was no longer feasible for reservists to make contact with their units, they were ordered to report to the nearest base of appropriate service. The President issued a statement at 4:30 a.m., indicating that he and all cabinet ministers were safe, but that dozens, perhaps hundreds of US congressmen had been killed by the blasts over Washington and other major cities. Offensive action had been commenced against the Soviet Union. Nuclear war was being waged in Europe and Asia too. Although at least 20 major American cities had already been reported hit, and twice that many missile installations and other military targets, the implication was that for some unstated reasons, the Russians hadn't unleashed as devastating an attack as might have been expected. To Neil, it meant only that worse might be to come. One exchange between 2 announcers on the Norfolk radio station particularly depressed and frightened him. "Is there anything new from the National News Wire, Herb?" a man's voice asked shakily. "There's still no contact with NBC in New York, John. All we've got, actually, are the items we're picking up from WTUV in Richmond. But they seem to have a direct connection with the federal government." "What about WBZE here in Norfolk? Do they have access to the ABC News Wire?" "No, all 3 news network services are out." "What about the West Coast centers?" "Los Angeles and San Francisco were both hit, John. There's just no contact." "What about military targets here in Norfolk area?" "The mayor has ordered the evacuation of all non-essential personnel," the other voice replied. "I'm afraid that the U.S. naval base here and the shipyards in Portsmouth, this would appear to be a prime target area." Neil knew that if Norfolk, at the mouth of the Chesapeake, were hit, they might never escape to the open sea. By the time they were away from Crisfield and on their way to Point Lookout, the net effect on Neil of listening to the frenzied preliminary reports of destruction had been to produce a strange and unexpected emotion that, he realized after a moment, was shame. He felt like a child whose classmates had run amok. Though he wasn't personally involved, the destruction was somehow his responsibility. Yet the dawn and early morning hours apparently belied the reports they were hearing. A third of the way across the bay, the day was clear. The sun shone brilliantly on the still water. A mile away, Smith and Tangier Islands lay lush and green and silent like some bucolic utopia. Land and houses on the now receding eastern shore lay gleaming with postcard clarity. There even seemed to be an oysterman up and working the beds to the southeast. It was as if the radio reports had been an Orson Welles prank. But to the northwest the nightmare was very much in evidence. A huge grey cloud had spread over half the horizon, a shapeless mass whose lower reaches were quite dark, Its upper borders, high overhead, now diffuse and ill-defined. A second area of cloudiness to the northeast was merging with it. Philadelphia? Only from the east through south to due west was the sky still clear. Norfolk still lived. By 8 a.m. the breeze began to pick up, and Neil felt that if it held or freshened further, they would make Point Lookout by 10:30. As their progress became routine and they stopped listening to the radio, Neil was saddened that he felt no desire to try to rush northward to anyone's rescue. When he imagined his parents struggling to survive after an explosion over Boston and the devastation of their hometown of Ocean Bluff, he felt depressed and vaguely ashamed. But the idea that he could get there and become a rescuer simply had no reality. Frank's plan was insane. For Neil, it was as if the war had created a new world, one that had ended all previous relationships. Your family would now be defined as whoever you found yourself with. And the new world, for Neil, would only survive if they could make it out to sea. "What do you know about nuclear fallout?" Jim asked from beside him, interrupting his thoughts. "Enough," Neil replied. "That stuff we see ahead of us is radioactive fallout," Jim said. He looked at Neil as if searching to see how horrible this fact really was. The grey cloud cover to the northwest was more pronounced now that the sun was higher in the sky. It also seemed to be spreading slightly towards them. "Yes," said Neil, "I expect it is." "It's going to spread," Jim said. "Yes," Neil replied quietly, "but we're almost 100 miles away." "We won't be at Point Lookout," Jim replied, "and even so, I think it's gotten closer since the sun came up." Neil squinted at it, as if noting this fact for the first time. "Maybe," he said, "but this northeast wind is helping us. It's moving the stuff away at right angles." "You told me earlier you thought the wind would be shifting to the north," Jim persisted. Neil went out into the port cockpit to adjust the Jenny sheet and then returned to the wheel. "We do what we must do, Jim," he said. "Right now we're sailing Vagabond to Point Lookout." "When that stuff starts falling on the deck?" Jim asked, still searching Neil's face for any sign of fear. Neil looked back at him neutrally. "Then we sweep it off."